All right, it is 7 o'clock Mountain Time, so we will go ahead and get started. Are there any questions from any prior material before we move on to new material? Nope. All right. So this is the last class, the final class in this series. Again, February, we take a break from the normal Tuesday introductory pattern because of the drop-in kind of lecture series that Charak Lama is doing, uh, which is Tuesdays and Thursdays in February. So let's move on to begin to talk about now. At the end of the last class, we talked about the obstacles to meditation. We talked about the five historical um, obstacles and then the five negative mental states that are often associated or implicated in the sorts of things that we become distracted by. We don't generally get distracted by, thinking about the paperclip that's on our table, right? Because it's such a neutral object. We get distracted by the arising of very emotionally charged objects, objects of attachment, objects of aversion, memories that involve, deluded pride, or thoughts that involve, plans that involve malice, anger, all of these different sorts of negative mental states, or the sort of very charged states of mind that give rise to the kinds of objects that have the power to draw us away from the objects. And so we talked about also, of course, some of the practical antidotes for the five conventional historical obstacles and the five negative mental states. We'll switch gears a little bit and talk about the way that it's presented in the FPMT's material are the four parts of any session of meditation. I'm going to add two additional parts. They don't necessarily apply to every single possible session of meditation because, of course, we might meditate, at our desk at work during lunch, for a few minutes, or when we get into our car, or before we get out of our car, we might take these short breaks. And so not everything necessarily is applicable to every possible way of meditating. But when we are at home and we're engaging in our formal practice and we've got the time and the space and it's sort of more um, controlled and everything is under our own control, then we can talk about these additional steps too. And I feel like it's helpful to introduce them um, rather than have people find out about them later when they're reading the Lam Rim or they're, taking a bit of a more advanced class, because they are very helpful things to think about, at least to consider in terms of a daily practice in one's own home. So the first two are the ones that I'm adding to what FPMT included in this particular course. So the first two parts, the first part is cleaning, what I would call cleaning the space. So in the very first class, we talked about an altar, having an altar, and an altar is just um, kind of a way of anchoring our space for meditation. And we talked about from the Buddhist perspective, the essential parts of an altar, an image of the Buddha, an image of, or a representation rather, of the Dharma, which is generally a text of some sort, um, and then a stupa. Um, so a stupa is an architectural, um, and these are also, when I say dharma, that it's also the speech of the Buddha, because the all of the sutras were spoken by the Buddha. So the image of the Buddha represents the Buddha's form. The text represents the Buddha's speech, and then a stupa represents the mind of the Buddha. So representations of the Buddha's body, speech, and mind are historically included on an altar. Um, and then there are 7 water bowls as well. I think we talked about water bowls a little bit. Um, but of course, an altar, the purpose of an altar, as I say, it's sort of the central focus of the place where one is meditating regularly in one's home. And it serves as a source of inspiration. It serves, and we'll talk about this, it serves as a place to make offerings. Um, so to practice generosity is the purpose, one main purpose of making offerings, because many times we don't have opportunities. We don't have an opportunity every single day to be out in the world and actually, if we, can find an opportunity out in the world to practice generosity, that's amazing as well. But also, it's true that when we practice generosity in respect to making offerings um, to the enlightened beings, to the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas, we are creating a connection that's a bit different than making charity or engaging in acts of generosity that relate to just other ordinary people. We should certainly do that, but we might be missing, you know, from the historical Buddhist perspective, if we don't make any offerings that are in relation to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, we might be missing an opportunity to create a connection between our mind and the mind of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So the altar serves as a place also to make offerings. So we have, this space that is anchored, as I say, with the altar, and I would say that the very first thing to do is to just look at that space and to think about what is in my, if I'm sitting in meditation, what is it that is in my visual field? Is there anything that is distracting? Is there anything that's out of place? Maybe to have a little feather duster and to dust the altar, even every day, even though it may not necessarily need it, but to get into that habit, and then to tidy up whatever might be in our visual field, so that the mind is presented only with things that are going to move the mind in a positive, uplifting direction. If there's, a, a the dog's chew toy or a sock, on the floor somewhere, then our mind is going to, not be, is going to be affected negatively by that kind of clutter. So we just want to scan before every session and straighten if we need to. So I would say for me, that would be step 1. Step 2, if you would like, is again to engage in some process of making offerings. And this can just be at the beginning of every day, particularly with the water bowls. There are 7, as we, I think, briefly addressed in the very first class. There's 7, traditionally 7 water bowls, um, and they represent things that a person would do if they were inviting over like an honored guest. Because when we meditate, from the Buddhist perspective, we are in some way trying to create a connection in various ways with, visualizations and so on. And we'll talk about visualization today as well. Um, but in some way, we are inviting, the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, the minds of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, to be present in our space in different ways. When we do, maybe we do the refuge prayer, that sort of thing. So these seven water bowls, they represent water for washing, water for drinking, light, incense, perfume, food, yeah, water, flowers. So basically, that's what you would do, right? If you were having your boss over for dinner, you would make sure that you yourself you would bathe, you would put on perfume or cologne, you would try to smell nice for the guest that you were inviting. You would probably try to beautify your physical space with maybe flowers. um, you would make sure that the air smelled nice. So you might light incense, or you might at least Febreze the environment. You might do something, or you would light a scented candle to make sure that there were pleasant smells. You would offer the person who came over, you would offer them something to drink, some kind of refreshing beverage you would offer. So that's the sort of pattern that we are replicating with the seven water bowls. We're replicating kind of the things that we would normally do. And of course, you can offer physical flowers as well. You can have a vase of flowers that you change out, you know, every 3, 4 days. You can offer food. Food is a very common, physical, like a bowl of fruit, um, or something, on your altar. Or you can have like packaged crackers, or because that might last longer. It doesn't have to be changed out as often. A bowl of, candies or packaged crackers or cookies or something may last longer. Um, so engaging in some process of making offerings is quite useful. So those are the first two things that traditionally you would start with. Um, from within this text or this course, FPMT starts with what they're calling preparation. So, with preparation, they are talking about one, checking in with the body. So, thinking about what kind of posture we're going to adopt, and making sure that so really they start with being seated, in meditation. Whereas I started with two things that you would do before you sat down. Once you have sat down, then you want to check in with your physical body and make sure that your posture is how you want it to be, whether, there's soreness going on in the body or something unique happening that day, a pain. You check in with the body and, try to situate the body in the most comfortable, but also most stable way that you can. Um, and then so we prepare the body in that way. And then we prepare the mind. So a few minutes of breathing meditation. And if anyone, I think Susan was there on Sunday when Elaine was talking about meditation, and she emphasized as well that um, even analytical meditations, they typically begin with a few minutes of breathing meditation, and we've mentioned that before. Really, it prepares the mind, it calms the mind, it helps to make the analytical session that's going to follow to be more productive. It gives you sort of an on ramp into the analytical portion of your meditation. And then you use the active analytical portion to give rise to an insight about the topic that you're meditating on. Once the insight arises, then again, you have another portion of stabilizing meditation where it isn't the breath that you're taking as the object, but it is the insight that has arisen in the mind. And you're just holding your mind, mixing your mind with that insight. So there's three steps to an analytical meditation, and that's what this is talking about: preparing the mind with a few minutes, 2, 3 minutes of, up to five of a breathing meditation to prepare the mind. Second step is to generate a virtuous motivation, a positive motivation. So to think about, and this is incredibly important. This is the most important step out of all of the steps that we're doing, is to intentionally generate a virtuous motivation. So, a virtuous motivation is one in which we think about the purpose of what it is that we're doing. And if if you come to, or if you've watched any of the morning express meditations or the evening express meditations, there's always a motivation where the students are thinking about not just themselves, that they're not just seeking something only for themselves, that the goal of the meditation is to serve a larger purpose. And this, as I say, is the most important step, because we get whatever we get out of an action is really determined by our reason for engaging in the action. So, for example, we might go to a talk, even a talk by like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, right? This extraordinary living master in the world. But if we do that because, let's say, we know someone at work who's into Tibetan Buddhism, and we think, and like we heard that the Dalai Lama was just going to be in town, and we think, oh, that would be a really great story to tell this person that I'm friends with, and maybe then they would like me. Maybe if I have this really interesting story to tell them, I can sort of use that to get them to think that, we have similar interests, or that's a really not great motivation, right, for going to something like that. Um, and similarly, we might do something really, really basic. We might just do a breathing meditation, right? Just not even an analytical meditation. We might only do a breathing meditation for 10 minutes. But if we think in our own mind that our purpose in doing that is because we want to make progress in creating the circumstances in our mind for developing penetrative insight, into making some progress in developing the skill of meditation for the purpose of achieving, let's say, I mean, we don't, a person certainly doesn't have to be at a place where the idea of full enlightenment, for the benefit of all sentient beings, is something that they're genuinely motivated by. But from the Buddhist perspective, as a motivation, there isn't any higher motivation than that. But again, that may not be our motivation. That may never be our motivation, and that's perfectly fine. But if we can think along the lines of, um, by growing in compassion and generosity and patience and ethics and so on, may I, you know, be of benefit to everyone that I come into contact with, because my own mind is changing. I'm developing greater patience. I'm developing greater love, greater compassion, greater generosity, a stronger ethical foundation. And may that be something that other people are benefited by. Then it isn't just for oneself alone. It isn't just, well, I'm doing this because I'm really stressed out at work and I don't want to be stressed out at work. Um, it's perfectly valid to acknowledge that we suffer and that there are benefits to having greater peace of mind, um, that might come from our practice, and then we might suffer less, and that's great. But also, we can think about, if I get to that place where I'm better at dealing with stress, I have more spaciousness in the mind. Things don't bother me as much because I don't react as much. I have, more capacity to choose how I respond to things. Then our relationships are going to also improve. Our ability to respond to people who might be, short with us, or might be, having a bad day and might be sort of aggressive. That is also helpful for them to encounter someone who has a mind like that. So there's many different ways that we can think about expanding why we're doing what we're doing and including other sentient beings in, you know, why it is that we do want to do what we are about to do. And the more expansive, the more um, encompassing and altruistic that motivation is, genuinely, of course, and genuinely, then the more beneficial what happens next is. Because what we're doing is just the way in which we are accomplishing our motivation. Like I said, if we might drive for an hour to go to this lecture by His Holiness, and but if the only thing that we're getting out of that is this story that we want to tell someone, we've lost all of the potential benefits of having been there, because the having been there, the action was just a way of getting the motivation, of accomplishing the motivation. So the bigger and better our motivation is, the more powerful anything that follows. So, and of course, this generalizes not just to meditation, but this generalizes to everything, right? We can go to work with an a more expansive motivation. We can go to the grocery store with a more expansive motivation. We can do everything with a more expansive motivation, and we can transform those ordinary activities also and make them, part of our spiritual path. But that's getting a little bit, off track. But it's also true. It's not just limited to things that seem virtuous in their own nature. So, of course, but incredibly important to take time to set our motivation. And there's formal kind of prayers and things that a person can use to help to generate that motivation. Um, or a person can write their own, or they can just on a day by day basis, just think about it organically at the time, um, whatever comes up. Okay, let me pause here. Any thoughts or questions that are coming up so far?
I do have a question, Venerable.
Yep.
Yeah, so when we're thinking about our motivation, I was reading these prayers, and one was saying one of the lines was something to the effect of like, "May I take on the suffering of others?" Does that sound right? So I guess I don't know. I've never heard that before. It just seems pretty heavy. So what is the purpose like generating selflessness in the mind, or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if we can get to it, there's a bit about what if there's depending on how much we get through, there's a bit about in this course about kind of the root of Buddhist practice, and maybe we can just do it now, um, which really is overcoming. We talked about in the last class, we talked about these, anger, deluded pride, attachment, and how ignorance, fundamental ignorance, is what motivates those. And we can phrase that also as the minds of what they call self grasping and the minds of self-cherishing. And self-cherishing, unfortunately, sounds like a really positive thing, right? Just as an English words, it sounds good. It sounds better, but it's not. It's I'm sure the Tibetan, like they have an easier time probably hearing the Tibetan and recognizing it as not positive, but they chose kind of really they should have. I mean, it would for us, it would be easier if it was just called selfishness or self preoccupation, which is what it is. It's not looking after oneself. It is a unhealthy preoccupation with just one's own interests, one's own desires, one's own preferences, one's own. And we're all ordinary sentient beings, right? So we are motivated, just generally, we are motivated by what they call the eight worldly concerns. We're motivated to increase our wealth, to increase our status, to increase our power, to increase our comfort. And we are afraid of any reduction in our wealth, our status, our power, and our comfort. So those eight, we want to increase those four, and we want those four to never decrease. Um, and so that is what's really driving the show, for us all of the time. And so, of course, suffering then naturally is that which we do not want. Um, and so, if we can, but enlightenment, a Buddha and even a Bodhisattva is someone who has none of that, who doesn't, who is completely free of that self preoccupation. Um, Even just a bodhisattva is someone who works only for the benefit of others. So the attitude of a bodhisattva is someone who would happily accept the suffering of others if that meant that they could, just like a mother, that of course we also, and I think Elaine at some point made that point, um, that like just an ordinary mother really oftentimes, many times, will have that same thought about when their child is suffering. Oh, I wish I was having this flu, and if they could, if they could really actually remove it and experience it for the child, they would. Now, they they are an ordinary sentient being, right? So it's limited, right? It's limited to their own child. They don't feel that way about the child 10 houses down, right? When that child gets the flu, they might be empathetic, but they're not thinking, may I take on the suffering of that? But in some form, we're all capable of that thought. Um, Even if it's only towards, so we have the seed of that intention, that thought. And really from the Buddhist perspective, we're just growing that. We're trying to generalize that to every sentient being, because that's what the mind of self-cherishing and the mind of self-grasping does not want. That is what we find aversive. So we're kind of flipping that habitual pattern. Um, it's it's an extremely advanced way of thinking, as is of course, we haven't really used the word bodhicitta in this course because this isn't really about Buddhist philosophy, but bodhicitta is the wish to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And that's, as I said, that's the most sublime motivation that anyone can have, but also of course a very advanced way of thinking. um, and in a way of in a way, if we work with ideas that we may not fully that we aspire to, right? We don't we might think about it and we might see that, we might see just oh, that's beneficial. I can see that I aspire to be like a bodhisattva. I can see the value in being in the world in that way. So we may not like at right now deeply, fully, actually have those real motivations, but we might work with those motivations because we see it as the direction that we'd like to move toward. We'd like to make progress toward that. Um, but it's not necessary. It's not like, as I said, a person can write their own motivation. Really, whatever, wherever a person is, and whatever feels kind of good and feels genuine, definitely that's fine. The idea just is to do our best to go beyond only thinking about, oh, this is going to make me feel better at the end.
Thank you.
Okay. Were there any other questions? So step 3 then is just the actual session of meditation, whether it's, meditating on whatever, impermanence, karma, loving kindness, compassion, generosity, patience, ethics, what have you, that the actual session of meditation, whatever we choose. And, again, we should choose this before we sit down. We should know as we sit down, I'm going to do a session on X, because anything that's not X is a distraction, right? Even if it's a virtuous object, if it doesn't fall within the bounds of our topic, it's a distraction when we should not indulge in it. So we should have a clear plan going into every session, that so that we're not like, oh, just, I'm just going to meditate. We need to decide what is the object of our meditation. And so this is that portion. The third portion is actually engaging in whatever the chosen object is. So thinking about, whatever analytical meditation, and then generating the insight, and then concentrating the mind on the insight. Um, and again, I think it's also good to decide for how long we're going to do that, um, because um, when this is a new habit, we're gonna have the experience of, wow, this is really dragging on. This is still like, is this, how many more minutes? So if we use some kind of timer that will make a sound, as Elaine said, Elaine's, a really renowned meditator. So she's done 3-year retreats, and she encouraged us during the one Saturday workshop to use something that makes a noise, because you don't want to be, opening your eyes and trying to look. You don't want to have anything, any kind of clock on your desk. But if you just set a timer that is going to give you a gentle chime after 10 minutes, or whatever it is, and that's quite good. And also, there's a discipline that you're building with that, in that it's ideal if you don't end your session earlier than you intended. You might bite off more than you can chew, but then you should try to finish that out, and then adjust, think, oh, well, maybe 15 was a bit optimistic. Next session, I'll do 10, see how that goes. But if you say you're going to do 5 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever it is, and you set this timer, then ideally, you wait for the timer to go off before you get up from meditation, because that is helping you to build discipline to really stick with the habit. And then the fourth step, the last step, so either the fourth or the sixth step, is dedication. And so here again, if you have attended or you've watched Morning or Evening Express, there's always dedication that is at the very last thing that's done in the class. And again, it's best if this is also as expansive as as you can make it. So here you are actively, before when you were doing motivation, you were actively thinking about why, who you were trying to benefit, um, and in what way, and how they would, hoping that they would be benefited. With dedication, you're thinking of all of the ways in which you hope that they were benefited by what you just did. So you motivated, and that was why you were doing what you were doing. And now you're dedicating. So you're thinking about all of the benefits that you wish for, arising out of what you have already done. Uh, and again, there's formal ways of doing that are written out in different ways. FPMT has a text. So you can go to fpmt.org, you can go to their foundation store. You can type in daily prayers. That's a text that will give you some ideas for both, formal ways of motivating and formal ways of dedicating. But you basically just want to think about the benefit that you've accomplished, and then thinking about that benefit, um, going outward to other sentient beings. And this is a also a really skillful way of working with the mind of self-grasping, the mind of self-cherishing, the mind that might co-opt our spiritual practice by thinking, oh, I just did this really cool thing that's going to be of benefit to me, right? That's this self-centered mind that we are all dealing with. That's kind of how it's going to relate to our spiritual practice. But by offering our spiritual practice to others, then we are countering that normal way of how we think. We're trying to think in a different way. We're trying to cultivate this wider, more altruistic attitude. Um, and this is something that you would do so these four things you do every single session. Every single session has motivation, dedication, the actual session, and that preparation, motivation, actual session, and dedication, whether you're doing one session or four sessions, in a day, every single time. You, if you have more time or you have less time, you might spend more minutes, doing some of these things. But ideally, you wouldn't skip any of them completely. You might do really, you know, and within Tibetan Buddhism, I mean, there are really beautiful dedication prayers, really long. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who was the international spiritual director of FPMT before he showed the aspect of passing away almost 2 years ago it'll be 2 years in April. He was a huge fan of dedicating, and he might spend, you know, 45 minutes dedicating. Um, because again, it's really important to offer your practice, to offer what you've done, to think about how it's positively impacting others. And there are, you can write your own, you can look at examples. If you just type in, again, in the foundation store, if you type in dedication prayers, or you look at the options that are in daily prayers, um, there can be extensive, that could take you 5, 10, 15 minutes to go through. And if you've got the time on a weekend or something, maybe once a week or twice a week, you think about doing longer dedication prayers. And then you can not only think about all of the beneficial things that you did in that one session, but you can think about all of the virtuous things that you've done that week, and you can offer all of those things. So maybe you just on Sundays you do longer dedication prayers, and you include all of your virtuous effort for the whole week, and when you're thinking about that.
When I was at the Gampa, I noticed people prostrating. Is that something that you do before you meditate?
Yeah, you certainly can. It's done if a person has an altar and they have a space, then they may every morning, for example, it isn't necessarily something that a person you could. I mean, if it was something that felt really good and really supportive, and you really got into it, of course it's good. It is the purpose of prostrating is it has a few different purposes, sort of psychologically. When there's a teaching that you're going to, then the act of engaging in prostration, it humbles the mind, because, and there's three different um, ways of prostrating. You can just do the gesture of prostration. That's the simplest way of prostrating. Um, then you can do a half length prostration, which is where you start out with the gesture of prostration, and then you touch the crown, you touch the forehead, you kind of go into the throat, and then you go back to the heart. And so these are chakras that you're touching. And then with a half length prostration, you would go down to your knees directly, and then you would touch your forehead to the ground with your hands out, just touching your forehead to the ground. A full length prostration is where you lay out completely. So you go down and then you go out fully straight with your arms in front, and then you come back and you go back vertically. Um, and typically three are done um, before a teaching, because again, one, it helps to prepare the mind to listen to the teaching by humbling the mind, because we might go into a teaching thinking, oh, I've already heard this topic before. Um, this is the 10th time that somebody's trying to talk to me about, whatever this topic is, and yeah, I've heard it all. So that's not a good attitude to have when you're going into a teaching. If you want to really get something out of it, you should go into it with a humble, open mind. And the physical action of prostration, you are physically, humbling yourself. So you're not prostrating to the teacher as a person. You're prostrating to the teachings that they are giving, the wisdom that they are giving, and you're prostrating. There's a view in Tibetan Buddhism that when there are holy objects, and particularly holy objects that have specifically been consecrated, been blessed by higher lamas, then that process of consecrating them, blessing them, kind of connects those holy objects to the energies of enlightened mind. So that's one reason as well that we might make offerings again on the altar, because the holy objects that are also present have, really, technically, once they have been consecrated, once they have been blessed and kind of imbued with this connection, which is, of course, an esoteric sort of teaching, um, then they are seen as, actual Buddhas, actual bodhisattvas, because they have this connection to that energy, that it just pervades all of, because the mind consciousness can pervade all of space and time. And so the consciousness, the minds of the Buddhas do pervade all of space and time. And so these are actual, representations of that. Um, so you're also prostrating to the wisdom of the teachings, and to the actual, the idea that the energy of enlightenment is in that space as well. So it isn't the physical human being that that you're putting yourself. And I mean, of course, it might be a bit different if that person is one's own guru. Then then one has a different kind of relationship, and one doesn't see one's guru as a regular, ordinary, sentient being. But that's a whole kind of different thing. But that person might be thinking about their prostrations also a bit differently. So certainly there are, if a person has an altar, and then to do three prostrations, maybe just in the morning, it can be helpful. Or if a person really likes doing it, before every session, or it, if it doesn't move the mind in a positive direction, then there's no point, right? It's not physical exercise. It's not, it isn't a push-up, right? So, it does need to be, a person needs to think about, like, why are they doing it? You wouldn't do it just because other people are doing it. Not everyone is doing it. And the people who really feel, they really understand, you know, why they're doing it. They feel like it is helping them to be more receptive, to be more open, to show respect to the teachings. Um, it is a physical, gesture that is um, motivated by what's actually in their mind. Um, so if a person gets to that place and they are doing it for that reason, and it's not just some sort of cultural, ritualistic kind of thing, but it actually is a part of one's practice, then it's wonderful to do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about visualization, which is a technique that is often employed in many ways in various kinds of meditations. Um, and it's hard to say. I, it could be, one thing that I just personally have kind of thought about, or wondered about, is that if you look at the brain, and we know, of course, that the brain and the consciousness are two different continua, but they are certainly very, very interconnected. And for us, like, our visual cortex is really large, and it's really an important part. Like, there's a lot of processing power that is devoted to the processing of visual imagery, for a person who's sighted, at least. And that's just true about how humans are made, how we're set up, how we're kind of hardwired. And also, if you tell people to imagine something visual, those same parts of the brain are activated, even though they're not observing a physical thing in front of them. It's, a lot of that same machinery is used when that is happening. So I think that because it's such an important part of our subjective experience, that maybe that's a reason why in Tibetan Buddhism they've integrated that. They've taken advantage of that as a way of um, sort of not hijacking, but piggybacking, maybe, on that system, and using that to deepen, to add that layer of processing, mental processing. And that in a way can help us to deepen the insights that we're trying to have. Um, so this technique, or this um, common occurrence of different visualizations, is really very pervasive in Buddhist meditations, Tibetan Buddhist meditations. It often, I would say, one way that it shows up is literally visualizing the forms of enlightened beings. And we do this again very often in Morning Express, and of course Evening Express is Vajrasattva practice, and Vajrasattva practice is always involving the visualization of Vajrasattva, the Buddha who has a connection with the purification of negative karma that has been deposited on our minds, that these non-virtuous imprints that are um, part of our mental continuum. That particular enlightened being has a strong connection to overcoming those imprints. Um, and that what that gets at too is that all of these different enlightened beings that we might visualize, they all have connections to different aspects of enlightened mind, enlightened activity. And it is it is true from the Buddhist perspective that all enlightened minds are the same, in the sense that they have completely eliminated all negativities, and they have completely perfected all positivities, all virtuous aspects of the mind. So there's no real difference between the mind of Vajrasattva, the mind of Chenrezig. Um, there's um, there's two ways of thinking about it, about how you could think of them as being distinct in some way. One is that they talk about, in general, when bodhisattvas are training and they're kind of on their way and becoming Buddhas, they they may make specific prayers, dedication prayers, really. May my enlightenment, it could be based on their own experiences, the kinds of things that they are seeing as they are experiencing, their specific bodhisattva existence. They might, because that's happening in a time and a place, and there are other sentient beings. Um, so they might be having unique experiences on that basis. And because they're having unique experiences, they might be making prayers that may my enlightenment be useful, um, of course, for every sentient being, but in particular in specific ways based on the kinds of suffering, that I feel this connection to based on the environment that I'm in. So we have the medicine Buddhas, we have Avalokiteshvara, there's Buddha Tara, there's Maitreya, there's Vajrasattva, there's Manjushri. You've got all of these different Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and Tara has 21 different aspects. There's green Tara and white Tara and red Tara and yellow Tara, and all. So and they all, as I say, they are representations of different aspects of enlightened mind. Um, so in one way of thinking about that, one way of thinking about that is the unique dedicating prayers that they made as they were training, um, which might help them to be, called upon in various ways for specific purposes. Another way, to think about it too, is just that we, as ordinary sentient beings, find it much easier to think about separate qualities individually. It's very difficult. It's probably impossible for us to grasp the the totality of the mind of a fully enlightened being, right? The perfection of every positive quality, the elimination of every negative quality. That kind of mind really is, I mean, in the scriptures they call it inconceivable. That's the word that's used. They say that grasping the mind of enlightenment is an inconceivable thing. So, but we can think about generosity. We can think about overcoming obstacles. We can think about loving kindness or purification of negativities. These individual qualities, it's easier for us to grasp in that way. So, a different way of coming at this is to think, well, these are practices that we have that were given to us um, for the benefit of growing in these different areas, in these different directions, because trying to do it all at once, for someone who's really ordinary, got a lot of afflictions going on, trying to grasp all of it simultaneously is probably not going to happen. But you know, thinking of Avalokiteshvara and thinking about compassion, thinking about um, Vajrasattva, thinking about purification, that we can manage. That that's doable. That's a different, that's yeah, two different ways that a person can regard that, and it's very common that people do these sorts of things, um, and it's also, I mean, just to mention, if a person gets, really, actually becomes Buddhist, actually goes for refuge, actually like this is their real path in life, it's also true then that all of, basically all of these enlightened beings, because we have practices for them, which are called sadhanas, just the text that takes a person through the process of meditating on Tara or on Vajrasattva. That text is just called a sadhana. Um, there are what are called empowerments that a person can take, which help that practitioner to create an even deeper connection to with that particular energy of enlightenment. So that's just something, to be aware of, that, you can take the empowerment of Vajrasattva or the empowerment of Chenrezig. These different empowerments are offered, but really, of course, they are only really appropriate. They're not casual things. They're really appropriate once a person is certain that Tibetan Buddhism is like their real path, and it's not, if a person just wants to kind of think about, think about Tara, or in a more casual way, that's fine. But the empowerments are more formal, a bit more serious. Um, and then another common element of visualization is the idea of what's called in English. I don't know what the Tibetan is at all. In English, they call it, they would say light rays and nectars. So light rays and nectars um, is something that is often uh, done in conjunction with the visualization of these enlightened beings. Typically, you would visualize light rays and nectars coming from these enlightened beings and, absorbing into oneself, absorbing into other beings that you visualize. But also, there's ways of visualizing this without the use of enlightened beings. For example, you might just visualize your own virtuous qualities as being like a ball of light at the heart, and you might, as you are sending out virtuous thoughts of, loving kindness, compassion toward others, you might join that with light rays, coming from you, going that are the kind of embodiment of your own loving kindness, your own compassion. And nectars is just a way when they talk about that, they mean, and there must be some psychological benefit. I actually don't really know um, why there are these two, but psychologically or in some subtle, energetic way, they must move the mind in a slightly different way. But nectar literally does mean sort of like they often talk about it as like being like honey, or the light rays having this kind of substance, this um, sort of like a honey-like sort of substance that is sort of carrying the blessing energy of the light rays. um, Again, I don't know why there's necessarily usually both, but it is common to talk about it in that way, where it's actually visualized not just as like photons of light, which are very insubstantial, but thinking about it as also being connected with like a nectar, like, like literally the nectar from a flower, like that sort of like a substance. Um, uh, yeah. Okay. Any thoughts or questions?
Yes, but I have a question. Well, it's probably going a little back what we were talking about earlier. I'm sorry, I should have probably brought it up then. So with the object of what we are going to, um, focus on. So I'm just wondering, is that just our own thing that we want to focus on, or are there actual meditation prayers or mantras or something that you can use for that, or do we just choose that, or maybe it's both? I'm not sure. Just wondering about how that would work. Um,
Yeah,
to do that every day.
yeah, it really depends on um what a person's overall like goal is, like what where do they see themselves, because it is your practice, it is personal to each person. um so it can absolutely be whatever. And I would always say that if a person's just starting out, then to really just focus on the things that a person feels most strongly connected to. To
Okay.
not worry, for a while, it's not really worry about, you know, a plan, an overall kind of plan, because in the beginning, really the goal is to create a new habit. And
Mm-hmm.
the easiest way to create a new habit is for whatever it is that you're doing to feel really impactful, to feel really, um, to have it move the mind in a way where you're energized, where you're encouraged, um, where you felt really good about it. And that's not true about all of the kinds of topics that are in the pantheon of options, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people might be, if a person is um, motivated to actually use their life, let's say hypothetically, a person has decided or is at least aspiring or thinking that they're interested in, maybe because even understanding what enlightenment really is, I mean, that takes time. I think that takes years. I honestly, I
Mm-hmm.
think, people might say, oh yes, Buddhism is amazing. But really, I think for just about everyone, and I'm not saying that I have like this perfect, clear, absolute understanding, but I can tell you that from the very first time that I ever heard anything about Buddhism, very quickly I felt an affinity. I mean, just for myself, I felt an affinity for what I was hearing, the kind of framework. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but then I would say 2 or 3 years later, I was like, oh, this is actually like kind of, I have a better understanding. It's different than it was. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, but of course, you're meditating and doing stuff for those 2 or 3 years. Um, but, so if a person has decided that like enlightenment is my thing, that's my goal, that's really, then the Lam Rim becomes the foundation of what a person is pulling from for their sessions of meditation, because their goal is to have realizations of these Lamrim topics, because the Lamrim is the distillation of all of the major teachings that the Buddha gave. And so the only reason that we're not a Buddha is because we've not yet had those insights. The Buddha had these insights in a very direct, deep, non-conceptual way, and they, on the basis of that, you know, the historical Buddha and all other persons who became Buddhas, all of those beings, their minds were transformed by those insights. And we've not yet done that, so we don't have the benefit of that transformation. But we can. There's no reason. Our mind is the same type of mind. There's no reason that we won't have that. We just haven't yet. In the same way that we don't maybe understand a lot about, the biology of, elephants. But if we wanted to, we could devote ourselves. We could spend the next 20 years really becoming an expert on the biology of elephants. That's open to us, right? Because our minds are ordinary. Our mind, like that's a thing we could do. Enlightenment is just a thing we can do, right? It's just an option that exists within reality.
Mm-hmm.
And we can choose not to, or we could choose to make progress in that direction. So if a person chooses to make progress in that direction, then it really is the Lam Rim
Okay.
that is the bulk of what a person would do. And in the Lam Rim, not everything is uplifting, not everything is roses, and it's you're meditating sometimes on death, sometimes it can be heavy sometimes. Um,
Mm.
but that may not be the best place to start if you really don't have a good habit. You don't find it easy every single day. Um, once you have a really firm foundation that is stable and that is consistent, then maybe you have the courage to think, well, not every single time that I'm going to meditate is going to be something that makes me happier, because thinking about one's own mortality, it's a very sobering topic. And
Mm-hmm.
even there's also like thinking about, if we want to not create the causes and the conditions of experiencing um, types of lifetimes where the suffering, the overt suffering, is more intense than what we are currently experiencing. Um, like that's a thing that happens, right? From the Buddhist perspective, our minds associate with forms, and some of those forms are going to have experiences that are more consistently suffering than is common for a human being to experience.
Mm.
And that's just a fact that's presented in the Buddhist perspective as just a fact about how our minds work and how reality works. But that's not ideal if your goal is to achieve enlightenment as quickly as possible. So we also need to think, so, and reason that our minds would do that is because there's a karma that's ripening at the time of death that is connected with that kind of energy of those experiences, that kind of realm, that kind of form.
Mhm.
And those energies are negative as opposed to positive. You don't at the time of death, a strong, virtuous seed is not the kind of seed that would be responsible for that. It would be a negative, non-virtuous seed.
Mhm.
So avoiding non-virtue and engaging in virtue are important parts of the path. And to motivate us to do that, we also need to, for example, think about the kinds of sufferings that occur. Um, and that's also quite sobering. But the purpose of it is not, the purpose of meditating on our own mortality is not to be morbid. The purpose of meditating on the sufferings that happen within cyclic existence is not to be depressed. It is to avoid, for example, with respect to our own mortality, to avoid wasting our lives in meaninglessness or non-virtue,
Mhm.
uh, or with respect to thinking about other kinds of existences, to avoid creating those causes, those karmic causes. So to but the actual sessions are kind of heavy, they're kind of unpleasant. So we have to get to a point where that's something that we're willing to do, that we want to do,
Yeah.
or we're just not someone who is like that. It's perfectly wonderful and valid for a person's entire practice to be thinking about loving kindness and compassion and generosity and patience, and the person might do that for years, and then they might grow and or evolve, and um
Mhm.
so the focus of a person's practice um can shift over time, absolutely. uh but if it is our goal to follow in the footsteps of the Buddha, then what we need to do is to have all of the same insights that the Buddha had. Just like if our goal is to become a heart surgeon, we know how to do that, right? They've made schools for that. There are curriculums for that. We know that a heart surgeon and not a heart surgeon, the only difference is that the heart surgeon has very specific competencies and knowledge and wisdom and capacity. Um, and not a heart surgeon, they don't have those. And you can't say that you're a heart surgeon until you've checked off all of those boxes. You've gone through exactly this so you're not doing whatever you want, right?
Mhm.
People who've come before have figured this out. They know these are the competencies, these are the capacity, and they have a checklist. And once you check all of those boxes, you are now a heart surgeon. And once you've checked all of the insights that the Buddha had off, now you're a Buddha, right?
Mhm.
It's exactly the same thing. Because the Buddhas came before, they know what we have to do. They're telling us what we have to do. They're showing us what we have to do. And all we have to do is actually get get through that process and have those realizations in our own mind for ourselves. Um, so, so that means just like the heart surgeon has to study, organic chemistry, and they're not so happy about it. Not everything is not everything is going to be, you know, fun in the moment.
Yeah.
But if we skip it, then we probably shouldn't expect that we're going to get that particular result. If we just say, "Oh well, that doesn't apply to me. I can skip that. I don't have to think about that." The implication is we might not get that result that we're looking for.
Yeah. So it sounds like I really probably, because I'm really far from there, but it would be really much like I'm just thinking the breathing, like really focusing on how to just do the breathing would be a big piece that could take a while. And then just choosing a word, or like say compassion or maybe forgiveness, and then wherever that takes you is sort of what you're doing.
It could be. I mean,
Uh-huh.
if you in terms of like positive emotions or positive, then like Kathleen McDonald's Awakening the Kind Heart, that might give you some individual ideas about how to go about that. Um, so, but yeah, I mean, if it's there's different ways, with, let's say, compassion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Compassion is the wish for oneself and all other sentient beings to be free of suffering and its causes, right? So you might think about your own suffering, and you might start with that, and you might think about ways in which you often suffer. Maybe you get migraines sometimes, or maybe you get anxious sometimes, things that
Mm-hmm.
just happen from time to time. So you visualize in front of yourself that, tomorrow's you is having a migraine. Um, and so when you visualize looking at yourself having a migraine, well, of course, the wish to be free of your own migraine is going to arise in your mind very strongly, right? Because you're you and you don't want to suffer. Um, right. So that's a easy entryway into giving rise to what it feels like to wish for someone to be free of suffering. Um, and then and sometimes but sometimes it's also true that not everyone has an easy time taking themselves as the object.
Mm-hmm.
They might take like their pet as the object, or their child, or their spouse, or their parent, um, or
Family,
their
some.
best friend,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
you think, well, this person is dealing with this disease, or this person is, often feels lonely, or and you visualize that. And then, because you love that person, you have a connection with that person, um, then easily, based on your familiarity with that person, you will be able to experience in a visceral way what the wish for them to be free of that is like. Um, then ideally, over time, you would want to generalize that experience. So you would bring to mind people that you know less and less well. Um, and then try to think, well, but they too are lonely often. They too are worried about their finances, or, they too um, get sick and experience the pain of illness. They too are worried about their death. Um, and so they have all of the same sufferings that my loved one has. And so it's reasonable for me to also wish for them to be free of that. Why would I only wish that for my family, my friends, and so on? Um, but it won't come as quickly. It's not as deep initially, of course, because if it was, then why would we need to practice it if it was all, that's the point,
Mm-hmm.
is
Yeah.
that it's easy for us to feel that way, but only in some limited situations. But we can generalize that to more and more sentient beings. And you can do that. One way is to just think of what are the word as you were saying, like what are the words, what are the phrases that naturally come to my mind, like may you be at ease, may you be free of suffering, may you be happy, may you, you know, get all that, is beneficial and supportive for you to experience. And literally just kind of saying those things. And or then if you want, you can visualize light rays going out and actually providing them with those things, and visualize that they are able to experience freedom from that suffering because of, so you're adding that visual aspect um, to your meditation. Another
Mm-hmm.
way of doing it is to take, as Susan was saying, like to visualize removing their suffering and bringing it into yourself. So
Mm.
relieving them of that suffering. And with that, you don't actually visualize that you yourself um, are actually experiencing the ripening of that, but just that you have removed it and it's destroyed completely by your taking it on. You don't think that, oh, now I have cancer, or now I mean, as a mind training, your willingness to do that, but actually in the meditation, it's never actually taught that when you're meditating that you start to visualize in that way. So it can get complicated, but that's another way of training, in compassion. Um, a third way of training is that Avalokiteshvara is the Buddha of compassion, right? So if you learn
Mm.
about the image of Avalokiteshvara, why does, because the images, they all have great meaning. They all have symbolic meaning for why, why is he holding a wish fulfilling jewel? Why is he holding a rosary? Is it thousand armed Chenrezig? Is it four armed? There's all of these, there's incredible depth of the symbolism of the physical form, which you have to understand. And then there's a mantra, as you were saying, all of the, Chenrezig has a mantra, Tara has a mantra, all of the different enlightened beings have mantras. And that's kind of an esoteric, teaching, this idea that the resonance of the mantra is somehow connected in a subtle esoteric way with that energy. Is kind of the embodiment of that energy and can help us to kind of align ourselves. That's Again, that's very esoteric, and we may or may not initially resonate with any of that. So, but there's all of these different options, right? And you just kind of find what do you resonate with. It's not like you have to resonate with this or it has to be like that, but you experiment and you just kind of discover what is working for you, and you stick with that.
Okay.
And then, yeah, I mean, as long as it doesn't change, as long as, like, if you're going to do compassion, as long as that doesn't change into like impermanence, right? A meditation on, like, if you're meditating on compassion and you're thinking about someone who's, near death, and then that reminds you of impermanence, you know,
Oh,
you don't want to go down and start like meditating on impermanence. You might do that in your next session. You would stick with compassion and then say, oh, well, maybe today would also be good to meditate on impermanence. Like then your next session, you would do impermanence. Um, but as long as you kind of know what are the confines of the topic for you. And so what's helpful about like books and things is that they'll kind of give you that confine. If it's something like, as you were saying, I mean, forgiveness is of course wonderful. You might just want to map it out a little bit, like beforehand, maybe like jotting out some notes, giving yourself like a framework that's written down. And
mm,
so you kind of, that might make it easier for you to have a clear sense of, have I actually strayed into what would be a distraction? Am I really still in the confines of, because each individual's meditation session should just be limited to the one topic.
okay. Okay. Oh, thank you. That was very helpful. Thank you so much.
Any other thoughts or questions?
I'm sorry, I do have one more question.
Mm-hmm, of course.
I don't think I was here. I don't think I was at the first teaching. So I didn't really get, and I understand if we don't have time, but maybe a way to how to set up the altar, because I know you were saying that it's really specific. And
Mhm.
so if there's a reference for me to follow, that would be
There,
really great.
there is FPMT does have a book. It's literally called Altar and Water Bowl Setup. Let me see. I don't think I. Okay, I've put that in the chat. It's a PDF that FPMT has. Altar setup and water bowl. The preliminary practice of altar setup and water bowl offerings is what it's called.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so it's basically just a table. I mean, you want it your altar, you want it to just be your altar. So you don't want to like use something and then like you take it down and you eat dinner on it and then you put it back. Like it should just be your altar, but literally it can literally just be like a long sort of a desk, something that you buy as like just a desk or a banquet table or something that's just sort of like they're generally sort of longer and skinnier. And then, you would put a nice, covering on it. Maybe brocade is common. Brocade is like a fabric that they make in Tibet, which they're making in Nepal and India now. But you might put brocade on it, and then, as I said, you put representations of the Buddha's body, speech, and mind, and then the water bowls, the 7 water bowls. But that's sort of and if there's, you might, whatever kind of moves your mind. So you might have, if you wanted to have a picture of His Holiness, you could have that, or any teachers that you were felt connected to, you could have images of them. Yeah, it's very personal. What moves your mind and what feels supportive um, for you. And of course, it's your altar. So there is a traditional historical way of doing it, but if you feel like you don't resonate with all of those things and you want to make some changes, it's whatever is beneficial for your practice. It's meant to uplift your mind, to give you a sense of inspiration, um, and to kind of be the focal point of where in your home you're meditating. Any final questions? We're just about out of time. Nope. All right. So Buddhism, in a nutshell, is what will be happening in March on Tuesdays, which is a 5-week class that's going to focus on a very, very broad overview of Buddhist philosophy, as opposed to meditation. And hopefully you can check out some of Charek Lama's talks as well that just coming up. They'll all be on Zoom.